For years in the 1980s, a scientist named Robert Sapolsky followed a troop of wild baboons in Kenya. He called them the forest troop, and they were, by baboon standards, completely ordinary, which is to say, brutal. Male baboons run one of the harshest hierarchies in the animal world. The big males terrorize the smaller ones, bully the females, and spend their days in a grinding tournament of aggression. That was the forest troop. And then something arrived that no one chose. A tourist lodge nearby had a garbage dump, and the most aggressive males in the troop, the ones bold and dominant enough to fight their way to it, began raiding it for food. What they didn't know was that the meat in that dump was infected with bovine tuberculosis. Over the mid-80s, the disease moved through exactly those males. About half the male population died. And because of who had fought their way to the poisoned meat, it was the most aggressive males, specifically, who were gone. What was left was a troop with almost no bullies in it. And the behavior of the survivors changed into something no one had ever recorded in wild baboons. The males groomed each other. Males never groom each other. The aggression collapsed. The troop became, for a baboon society, gentle. But that is not the strange part. The strange part is what happened 10 years later, when every single baboon who had lived through the die-off was gone. So here is the question this episode answers. When you walk into a group, a company, a country, a family, and you feel its character close around you, its unspoken rules about what is done and not done, where did that come from? You assume the people there made it. But what if almost none of them did? What if the thing running the room was set in motion by people who are all dead now, and everyone alive is just carrying it, enforcing it, passing it on, without knowing why?
If you have ever joined an organization and found yourself within months defending how we do things here, rules you did not write for reasons no one could quite explain, you have already felt this. You just were not told a troop of baboons ran the whole experiment first and proved that the character of a group can outlive every individual who ever gave it one. There is a document in the modern half of this story. It is a single page. It was written by a man who, by the time it matters most, will have been dead for almost 40 years. And on one terrible week, when 7 strangers have died, and a giant company must decide whether to destroy itself to do the right thing, that dead man's page, not any living executive, is going to make the decision. Keep the page in mind. It hasn't gone off yet. Now, Rome. But not the Rome of the emperors, the Rome of the early Republic, 5 centuries before Caesar. In the year 509 before the Common Era, the Romans expelled their last king, a tyrant named Tarquin, and swore a collective oath: never again, never another king. The very word, rex, became the most poisonous sound in the Latin language. Now, watch how long a culture can enforce a rule after everyone who made it is dust. That oath was sworn by a specific generation of Romans with a specific living hatred of a specific king. But the horror of monarchy it installed did not fade when they died. It hardened. It was transmitted intact to Romans who had never seen a king, could not have picked a king out of a crowd, and yet would kill to prevent one. A century and a quarter later, a man named Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, a genuine hero, the soldier credited with saving Rome from a sack by the Gauls, began championing the poor and the indebted against the aristocracy. He grew popular, beloved, and that popularity alone, the mere shape of a man the crowd might follow, tripped the ancient alarm. He was accused of aiming at kingship. He was condemned and thrown to his death from the Tarpeian rock, the very hill he had saved. No one alive had suffered under Tarquin. The king was 125 years dead, but the culture he had provoked was still on patrol, and it executed one of Rome's greatest men for the crime of being someone a crowd could love. The Romans who killed Manlius to stop a king had never met one. They were defending a wound none of them had received, and Manlius was not even the first. A generation earlier, a man named Spurius Cassius, 3 times a consul, the author of a law to give land to the poor, was accused of the same imaginary crime, of using his generosity to buy his way toward a crown. He was condemned and killed, and the tradition records that it was his own father who denounced him. So total was the culture that a Roman would give up his son rather than be suspected of harboring a king. The Republic even built the horror into its calendar and its offices. It kept 2 consuls instead of 1, so no single man could rule. It drove them out of office after a single year. It made men swear, again and again, generation after generation, to kill anyone who tried to make himself king. The oath was renewed by people for whom Tarquin was not a memory, but a boogeyman in a story. And it worked, for 4.5 centuries, precisely because it had stopped being a memory and become a reflex. Here is the mechanism, and it is the baboon troop in a toga. A founding event, an expulsion, a die-off, sets a group's character. Then the founders vanish. And the character does not vanish with them. It is inherited by people who never lived the event and enforced by them with a conviction that has nothing to do with memory, because it was never a memory. It was a culture. And a culture is a set of instructions that runs long after the last author is gone. Rome's inheritance was a fear. But the same machine can transmit the opposite, can take a group of ordinary, frightened men and stamp them with a character so deep, so self-copying, that it outlives the kingdom that forged it and marches on into armies that no longer have a country. If you have ever inherited a way of being from an institution, carried its discipline, its silences, its sense of what a person owes, long after leaving it, and realized it was still running you, then the next story is about the deepest version of that lock ever engineered. Subscribe. Primal Loops finds this loop somewhere new every week. Prussia, the early 18th century. A king named Frederick William I takes a small, unremarkable German state and does something to it that will echo for 200 years. He builds an army, and more than an army, he builds a culture around it, an ethic of absolute duty, austerity, obedience, and service. He drills into the aristocracy the idea that a man's life is not his own. It belongs to the state, and honor is the discharge of duty without question or reward. He dies, and the culture does not. It is absorbed by his son, then by officers who never knew either of them, then by generations of Prussian soldiers who inherited the ethic the way you inherit a language, completely, invisibly, as simply the way a serious person is. The baboon newcomer learns in 6 months not to bully. The Prussian cadet learned, without being able to say when, that his life belonged to something larger than himself. And here is the proof of how detached a culture becomes from the people and even the country that made it. The kingdom of Prussia was formally abolished, first shrunken, then dissolved, its name wiped off the map in the middle of the 20th century. The state was gone. But the culture it had stamped into its officer class did not die with the state. It kept running in the men who carried it, some of whom turned that same inherited sense of duty into resistance, some into obedience to horrors. The software outliving not just its authors, but its entire nation, still executing in people for whom Frederick William was a name in a book. And notice the machinery of transmission, because it is the same as the troops. Prussia did not leave the ethic to chance. It built cadet schools that took boys young and returned men stamped with the code. It surrounded the young officer with older ones who embodied it, so that the newcomer absorbed the character the way the baboon immigrant absorbs the troops, not by being taught a rule, but by stepping into an atmosphere that quietly made him into a certain kind of person before he noticed it happening. The individual officers came and went, lived and died. The mold did not. It kept pressing the same shape into new metal, century after century. The page is still waiting. The man who wrote it is alive right now, in this part of the story, writing down what his company believes, with no idea that his words will one day, long after his death, walk into a crisis and decide it. Because we tell ourselves that in the modern world, at least, decisions are made by the people in the room, by living leaders weighing living facts. And then you look closely at the most admired corporate decision of the 20th century, and you find no living author at all. You find a dead man's page, going off exactly on schedule.
So here's the page. In 1943, the head of the company Johnson & Johnson, a man named Robert Wood Johnson, wrote a single document he called the Credo, a plain statement of who the company's first responsibility was to. Not shareholders, the patients and doctors who used its products first, above everything. Then he grew old, and he died, and the page was hung on walls and mostly, as these things are, forgotten. The United States, the autumn of 1982. In the Chicago area, 7 people, including a 12-year-old girl, swallow extra-strength Tylenol capsules and die within days. Someone has laced bottles on store shelves with cyanide. Tylenol is Johnson & Johnson's single most profitable product, and the man who now runs the company, a chief executive named James Burke, faces the kind of decision that defines whether an institution has a soul or only a balance sheet. Every incentive pointed one way. The poisonings were confined to a small area around Chicago. The tampering was not the company's fault. The experts and the instinct of the industry said, contain it, reassure the public, protect the brand, do not panic. A limited local response was available, defensible, and cheap. There was a door marked, "Manage it quietly," and it was the door almost any company would have walked through. James Burke did not walk through it. He ordered a total national recall of Tylenol. Every bottle, 31 million of them, pulled from every shelf in the country, at a cost of around $100 million, wiping out the company's flagship product overnight, to make sure not one more person could be harmed. And when people later asked him how he had made such a clear, fast, ruinous, correct decision under that much pressure, he did not point to a strategy meeting or a poll. He pointed at the wall, at the Credo, at a page written 39 years earlier by a man who had been dead since 1968, which said the patient comes first, and which, in the worst week of Burke's life, did not advise him. It decided for him.
And watch what the decision became afterward, because this is the transmission happening in real time. The recall worked. The public trusted the brand again. Tylenol came back in the first tamper-proof packaging the industry had ever seen. But the deeper thing that happened is that the week itself became a story, a founding legend the company would tell every new employee who ever walked in the door. The Credo, the page, was no longer a forgotten plaque. It was proof, scripture, the moment we showed who we are. New hires who were children in 1982, who had no memory of the deaths, would now inherit the reflex, the way the Roman inherited his, as simply the kind of company this is. The dead founder's page had not only made one decision, it had used that decision to copy itself forward into people who would not be born for decades. We tell ourselves that great decisions come from great individuals, that in the moment of crisis, a leader reaches inside and finds his own character. Look at what actually happened, and it inverts. The most celebrated act of corporate conscience in modern history was not, in the deepest sense, made by the living man who signed it. It was made by a dead one, through him. The founder's culture reaching 40 years past the grave to move the hand of a stranger who had inherited it without ever being asked. The Romans killing a hero for a dead king's sake. The officers of a kingdom that no longer existed. an executive obeying a page older than his own career. None of them were acting on their own character. All of them were carrying someone else's forward into a moment those someones never lived to see. Go back to Sapolsky's Baboons, to the 10 years later that I promised you, because it is the whole point.
By the mid-1990s, not one male who had lived through the tuberculosis die-off was still in the troop. Male baboons leave the troop they are born in and join a new one at puberty, so the entire adult male population had turned over. Every gentle survivor of the original catastrophe, gone. The new males had arrived from ordinary, brutal troops elsewhere. They were not special. They carried no memory of the die-off. They had never heard of it. They arrived as aggressive as any young male anywhere, and within about 6 months, the troop had made them gentle too. The peaceful culture had not lived in the survivors' genes or their memories. It lived in the troop itself, in the females who would not reward aggression, in the atmosphere a newcomer stepped into and was slowly reshaped by. The founders were dead, the event was forgotten, and the culture went on manufacturing its own members, one immigrant at a time, decades after the last creature who chose it had died. That is the loop. The Roman mob on patrol against a king none of them had met. The officers of a vanished kingdom. A dead founder's page deciding a living man's crisis. And a troop of baboons quietly civilizing strangers who never knew why. None of them were the authors of what they enforced. A culture is not a thing a group of people decides to have. It is a thing that has them, that outlives every one of them, and reaches into each newcomer and writes itself into him before he ever thinks to ask who is holding the pen. You did not choose the character of the room you are in. The room is choosing yours. Almost nothing about how you behave inside your groups is a decision you made. It is an inheritance you received from people who died before you arrived, and are now passing, unexamined, to everyone who arrives after you. This is the loop Primal Loops exists to keep finding. The dead hand steering the living, in a savanna, a republic, a dead kingdom, a boardroom, certain each time that it is simply how things are. Next week, we go small and sharp, to an animal that can tell, by your face alone, whether you are lying about who you are. Subscribe so you are in the room when it does. And before you close this, look at the group you spend your days inside. Notice the rule no one can quite justify, the value everyone repeats, the way we do things that no living person actually chose. Ask who wrote it. You will find almost always that they are gone, that you are running code left behind by people you never met, and that the newest person in the room is, right now, being quietly rewritten by you into a shape decided long before either of you walked in. So the only question left is the uncomfortable one. The values you are most certain are yours, the ones you would defend hardest, enforce most fiercely. Are they yours at all? Or are you just the latest creature the troop has civilized, carrying a dead hand's instructions forward and calling them your character? Name the rule in your group that everyone enforces and no one can explain. The one whose author is long gone, but whose culture is still on patrol. First one in the comments. Animal Register. EP18 equals Olive Baboon. Sapolsky and Share, 2004. Distinct species, locked.